All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're still having a lot of people who haven't joined us yet, but I want to be cognizant and respectful of everyone's time. So we're going to start this. The program is being recorded and will be posted on the league's site later, along with the PowerPoint presentation. So if you miss something, you'll be able to come back to it later. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mike Serra. I'm the Executive Director of the League of Municipalities, and I thank you for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn program on the new NJDEP Real Rules, which stands for Resilient Environments and Landscapes. We're joined here today by some folks who have done a deep dive into this. So to provide you an overview and sort of a timeline and some efforts on advocacy. Just let's do some housekeeping issues first. I would ask, this is kind of a webinar, but we're doing it in a Zoom meeting format. So please keep yourselves muted. I think we've all been on enough Zooms where somebody who is not muted has taken a phone call and we've maybe heard things that we don't really needed to hear. I don't want to do that to anybody here today, so please keep yourselves muted, particularly during the presentations. Questions and answers we will deal with at the end. You can put them in the chat box. Sierra Bradley, the league's research associate, will be monitoring the box for questions as well. So if you have a question, you can drop it into the box as well. I want to thank our speakers today. First is John Scagnelli, who is the league's environmental counsel. John's law practice covers the entire environmental law field. The firm is Skirmitsy and Hollenbach, deals with compliance, litigation, auditing, permitting, counseling. He serves many local government entities as well as some commercial entities. We also have joining us Tony Mercantante, who is the administrator in Middletown. He is also a professional planner and a longtime member of the League Legislative Committee. And lastly, we have Frank Marshall, the League's associate counsel, who is our point person on this proposal. With that, I want to hand the baton first to John. John, thank you for being here. You've served the league well through the years, John, and it's good to see you. And with that, John Scagnelli, please.
All right. Well, thank you, Mike. Appreciate the introduction. And what I want to do is basically we're going to do two things today. First, I'm going to provide a general overview of the DEP Resilient Environments and Landscapes Rule, a real rule. I mean, we'll be just referencing the real rule. Rule is over 1,000 pages. It's out for comment by the DEP. There have been a number of sessions relating to it that have already been held. And the comment period, though, is still open until November 3rd. So I'll provide a general overview, and then Tony will get into a deeper dive as to the impact of the rules on development, and particularly with respect to our shoreline communities, number of issues raised with respect to this rule and how it affects the shoreline communities and some of the other communities in the state, in the interior also, by way of wetlands impacts and considerations. And then Tony will have some photographs to illustrate the points. A very complex rule. It's tough to digest, but a number of groups within the state have been working their way through it. So, and Frank, you're going to handle the advancement of the slides, right? I'll just ask you to change slides as we go. So, and we have a PowerPoint here that that provides some talking points for me. I mean, this real rule is actually part of Governor Murphy's Protecting Against Climate Threats Initiative, or PACT initiative, which really was kicked off by his executive order number 100 in January 2020. And this rule amends the existing coastal zone management rules, the Freshwater Wetlands Protection Act rules, the flood hazard area control rules, and the stormwater management rules, and quite a bit of impact. And as I mentioned, public hearings, I think we're past those. We have the comment period open until November 3rd. And basically what this rule does, it's based upon increased precipitation and sea level rise predictions relative to New Jersey. Last year, DEP passed inland flood protection rules in 2023, which also focused on current and future precipitation increases and effects on fluvial areas and stormwater management. And there were also changes that the state made to the stormwater rules relating to climate change and stormwater management. So flooding, stormwater management, sea level rise have been big issues for the department. So next slide, Frank. Okay, what are the key points of the rule? And again, this is really a 3,000-foot overview. The point is to adjust coastal flood area hazard areas for projected rising sea levels and storm surge, to extend the flood hazard area further inland, and require higher first floor elevations or flood proofing for buildings and higher roadways. The next point that the rule has is it creates inundation risk zones, or IRZs. You'll hear a lot about that today, to address risks for residential building and critical structures in areas of permanent or daily inundation or flooding due to sea level rise. The rule also proposes changes to stormwater management practices to improve water quality and reduce flooding. It encourages what the department calls nature-based solutions to protect communities and resources. It supports renewable energy by balancing habitat conservation with novel infrastructure demands. It states that its objective is to improve state alignment with FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program. And there are provisions in this rule to streamline the DEP permitting process. DEP's position is to better track authorizations and permits relating to construction projects. Next slide. Okay. The DEP, in developing the rule, identifies in the rule itself a series of what it calls rulemaking principles, and I just want to list these. The first one, increase protection against future flood, inundation, and damage from sea level rise and extreme storm events. Protect critical facilities and infrastructure from the effects of climate change. Restore water quality and reduce flooding, especially in urbanized areas. Increase resilience of land and water resources. Plan for climate change. Design using nature-based solutions. Encourage renewable energy, and to improve the administrative process. So let's go to the next slide. All right, let's zero in on principle number one, increase protection against future flood, inundation, and damage from sea level rise and storm events. As I mentioned, the rule creates an inundation risk zone, or IRZ, in tidal flood hazard areas. And the IRZ is a portion of a tidal flood hazard area determined to be at significant risk for future permanent or daily flooding. Standards are proposed for new or improved residential buildings, and critical infrastructure within the IRZ to account for increased flood risk due to expected or projected sea level rise and more intense storm events. And one point I want to make here, it's not on the slide, there's a 3% impervious cover standard for IRZs, and also with respect to any of these tidal flood areas, so it applies to all development, the 3% impervious cover requirement, and that's an issue for a number of groups within the state, which we'll get to. In the IRZs, there needs to be an inundation risk assessment performed, examining potential injury, damage, cost of inundation, and an applicant for a project in an IRZ has to do an on-site analysis, an alternatives analysis, to show its efforts to avoid or minimize risks. This analysis is not required if the project involves repairs or maintenance in the existing building footprint, which doesn't change the building height. Next slide. An inundation risk zone applicant must show mean high water elevation at the nearest site minimum amount of inundation or flooding, which would cause the lowest portion of the site to be flooded or inundated on a regular basis, and the maximum depth of inundation, where the project involves construction of or improvements to a building, the minimum amounts of inundation or flooding which would cause the lowest portion of the primary roadway providing regular or emergent access to be inundated daily, and the maximum depth of inundation on the roadway. The impact of roadways is a big issue here, and we'll get into that in a deeper dive in a little bit later. And 4, efforts to mitigate, including altering topography and changing the project configuration. Next slide. Okay, what DEP states is that 94% of the IRZ is already developed in the state, the IRZ zones, and that most of the projects impacted will involve redevelopment. Now, here's where the rubber meets the road. What the rule does, it redefines the extent of tidal flood hazard areas, and it replaces the existing flood hazard area design flood elevation, and those engineers in the group know what that is, with a proposed what's called climate adjusted flood elevation, or CAF, or CAFE, the way they have it. The proposed CAF is calculated by adding 5 feet to FEMA's 100-year flood elevation in tidal flood hazard areas, plus 1 foot of freeboard. So to take the example I have here, for a residential project, if the preliminary FEMA flood elevation is 11, then you have to add 5 feet to that. That brings you to 16. 1 foot of freeboard, that brings you to 17. That's a huge increase. And for commercial development, the building can be elevated or flood-proofed, or both. Habitable floors must be dry flood-proof, but non-habitable floors can be wet flood-proofed. Okay, next slide. And this is getting into a little bit, maybe a little bit of complexity. The rule does not address the height variance problem or issue where the developer is squeezed between the higher first floor elevation and the maximum height of the building permitted by local ordinance. The inland flood hazard rules adopted in 2023 require in fluvial areas a 3-foot additional first floor elevation requirement, and the proposed real rule requires in tidal areas an additional 5-foot elevation requirements. And those of you who work in this area know about the dry access rules. This rule does not appear to provide relaxation of the dry access rules relating to roadway. There's some, confusion about this. It needs some clarification. Next slide. Okay. Principle number 2, protect critical facilities and infrastructure from the effects of climate change. And this rule contains more stringent design and construction standards for critical facilities and infrastructure, and typically would be governmental facilities. Next slide. Let's go to the next slide, if we may. Here we are. Okay, principles 3 and 4, restore water quality and reduce flooding, especially in urbanized areas, and increase resilience of land and water resources. The real rule changes the freshwater wetlands rules to require applicants to demonstrate that wetlands impacts are necessary for completing a project independent of whether the impacts meet other wetlands criteria. Wetlands permit applicants must demonstrate compliance with stormwater rules for any project impacting wetlands or transition areas associated with a major development. For new development, applicants are required to remove the existing impervious surface where practicable within 25 feet of wetlands under special activity transition area waivers. A developer must ensure all activities in wetlands transition areas are situated at least 25 feet from freshwater wetlands. Next slide. The DEP's real rule applies to wetlands general permits. So now we're in the wetlands dynamic. We're away from the tidal areas. We're talking about wetlands. This affects interior sections of the state. Even if the project meets the criteria for a wetlands general permit, the applicant must prove that the wetlands impacts are necessary, and that there are no other practicable site configuration, or there is no other practicable on-site configuration which would avoid or reduce the impact to wetlands or state open waters. The rule and the flood hazard area rules will now require that certain isolated waters draining less than 50 acres, previously unregulated, will now be regulated to better protect headwaters. Next slide. Okay. Department will apply a 150-foot riparian zone to regulated waters based upon potential impact to endangered or threatened species that are considered critically dependent on the regulated water for survival, and require riparian zone mitigation for all impacts within 150-foot riparian zones that individually or cumulatively exceed 2,000 square feet. Applicants need to provide riparian zone mitigation and a 50-foot riparian zone when on-site impacts cumulatively exceed 0.1 acres. A 25-foot setback from the top of bank or bulkhead is mandatory with some exceptions. And finally here, the rear rule amends the stormwater management rules to require reduction of runoff volumes from major developments and will require total suspended solid removal for stormwater runoff from both new and redeveloped parking areas. The new rules require water quality treatment for a redeveloped motor vehicle surface, even if there is not a net increase of a quarter acre of impervious surface. Next slide. Get the next slide, Frank, if we could. There we are. Principle number 5, planning for climate change. The REA rule requires, as mentioned, an inundation risk assessment for certain flood hazard and coastal rule applicants to consider human health and safety implications of constructing a project in an area identified as subject to increased risk of daily or permanent inundation due to sea level rise. And we talked about the need for an inundation risk assessment previously. Next slide. Principle number 6. The REA rule encourages the permitting and implementation of nature-based resilience projects. I'm not going into any detail about that here, but I just want to make you aware that there are provisions in the rule relating to this. Next slide. Encouraging renewable energy. One example here is that the rule adds standards to the submerged cable rule to allow the installation of electrical cables associated with offshore wind development. And that's, some of you, I'm sure, on this call are familiar with the wind turbine situation, as well as other amendments to facilitate permitting for offshore wind. And the flood hazard rules are amended to discourage the installation of solar panels in open waters or forested areas. Next slide. Principle 8, improve the administrative process. Existing NJDEP permits by rule are going to be readopted in one of these categories: limited categorical exemptions, general permits by registration, permits by certification, or general permits under the flood hazard and coastal rules. And next slide. 14 existing permits by rule will be converted to permits by registration, and 6 existing permits by rule will become permits by certification. In individual cases, an individual permit will be required for activities currently permitted under a permit by rule. Certain categorical exemptions are proposed for minor repair and property maintenance activities. Okay, next slide. I think we're okay. That's quite a lot. And I apologize for throwing that at you in the way I did in a quick pace, but it provides at least an overview and a framework. Obviously, the concerns here, you're thinking about the 5-foot elevation, the impact particularly on our shoreline communities. It's a major concern. Certain of the business and industry groups, including the New Jersey Business and Industry Association, have been working on this, analyzing this, and at this point, very concerned about the rule, and the major bases of concern are that the DEP used 75-year projections with respect to sea level rise um, to come up with the 5-foot requirement. And that's a concern. And a number of studies out there have already stated that that's a bit aggressive. You might be better using a lesser number, perhaps 2 feet. There's a concern about the IRZ, inundation risk zones, concern about the 3% impervious cover, concern about the impact here on roadways. So there's a lot of analysis going on here as to the impact of these rules upon issues that are important for municipalities and building development communities in the state. I mean, I'll just quickly tick them off. Impact on the tourism industry. What about the impact on affordable housing, regular market housing? What about the ADA accessibility requirements? What about preparing detailed flood maps? Having the state do that so impacted municipalities can evaluate what the impact of this rule would be on their communities. So what you're seeing is a focus on consequences of this, and in addition to the focus on the science behind using such a long tail projection running up to current. Big questions, and I'm sure many of you, I see some looking at the list here, I see some firms and some engineering firms that I'm sure are involved in analyzing this all right now. So let me leave it here. What I'd like to do now is hold on any questions. Let's turn it over to Tony to really go into more of a specific on the ground analysis of what the impacts are going to be here. So, with that, Tony, I think there's some photographs at the back end of the PowerPoint. So there we are. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, John. Appreciate it. So I want to go through this somewhat quickly, but I'm just showing you a sense of where the community is. If you go down to slide 25, Frank. Yeah, so as you can see, this area of Middletown, currently the Port Monmouth section, is currently having and you see the amount on there, $130 million.
Tony, if I may, yeah. You're getting a little bit gravelly on the audio connection. Someone has noted in the chat. Is there any way for you to check that?
Let me check.
Maybe it'll clear up.
Okay, better?
A little better.
Okay. What you'll see here is a map of a flood control project that's currently under construction by the Army Corps of Engineers. As you can see on this slide, it says $130 million.
Tony, I hate to interrupt you for the second time, but we're not hearing any improvement on the audio. According to, it's still gravelly. Someone suggested a different mic. Is there a way to
well,
do anything different over there?
I only have one computer. I don't know what to do unless I exit and come back in, maybe.
You could probably call in, Tony, and just mute yourself on the video side. That might be a little bit better if it's
that's a good idea.
Issue.
It's a good idea
on the computer.
Okay. Is the numbers okay?
I was going to suggest to make better use of time, John, while Tony's dialing in, are there any questions in the box we can address?
There are quite a few. There are quite a few. I mean,
well, Sierra, why don't you start with the first one, and then
let's see what we have here.
Yeah.
When does this go into effect? Okay, Lacey. Well, right now the projection is July of 2025. Right now the comment period here is projected, will close. If you go on DEP website, they have a drop-down menu for the rule. You can look at that. That lays it all out, has a copy of the rule. So the projection is for July of 2025. I can tell you that a number of, a number of parties or groups of concerned about this, and maybe Frank can talk about the league in a second, are going to be requesting an extension of the time to put in comments relating to some of the issues we're surfacing with you today, to try to put that off.
Yeah.
Frank, you want
So
to say something about that?
Yeah, I'll just jump in there. I mean, the league is obviously, we're not the only folks that are very interested in these rules. All types of entities are trying to wrap their head around it. I mean, it's impacting so many different rules. It's over 1,000 pages, almost 1,050 pages of rules that are changing. And so the league is requesting, and so are so many other organizations, to just be given more time for this. DEP did have a 90-day time frame on this, and they did some stakeholdering beforehand, but it's just, quite frankly, it is not enough for everyone to be able to review it, understand the impacts that it's going to have individually on their municipalities, and then to give any substantive comments. So obviously, working in anticipation that the comment deadline is still going to be November 3rd, we are also trying to seek an additional extension of time. Nothing at this point has signaled that that would be granted or allowed, but I think that DEP should take everyone's concerns in effect and grant that, but we won't know if we get something until later on.
Okay. Let's see, there's a few other questions. Permit by rule or to an individual permit? Well, they're going to be converting and reclassifying existing permits by rule to permits by registration and permits by certification, which in some cases individual permits were required for certain activities currently permitted under a permit by rule. I can't, based on, to this, I can't give you the specific detail as which permit by rules are being considered for a change. And this is to Frank Russo, what I can suggest is you dive into, or have your engineer, if you're not already an engineer, dive into the rule, into the section about the permitting to pull up the answer. It's kind of a mixed bag. You're going to have permits by rule that are going to be converted to permits by registration, and permits by certification. There will be a need for individual permits in some situations. So the permitting structure here to implement this, I really can't answer it at this point. I think you need to take a deeper dive into those particular sections. And that really covers the next question that Margaret had asked, where can we get more info on freshwater wetlands changes? Again, what will need to happen is, again, it's in the rule generally, specifically. I think that the best answer to that is to get if you're involved working for a municipality, or your consulting firm, engineering firm involved in this area, you need to dive specifically into the rule and do an analysis of it. I mean, as specifically on the freshwater wetland side. I will tell you that to date, the groups in the state who have been actively on top of this have principally focused upon the shoreline tidal impacts because of concern about flooding. For example, Cape May County and 16 municipalities within Cape May have filed and prepared detailed resolutions with stating their concern about impacts on shoreline communities. I haven't seen any specific analysis done in the interior on the wetland side of it. And I would say if your municipality has wetlands areas slated for development, you might want to look a little bit closely about this. That would be
Yeah,
my
and-
answer.
And it looks like Tony, I don't know if you're back on now. It looks like you've changed here, but if you wanted to jump back on to just
Right.
continue with the
Yeah, go
presentation.
ahead.
Yeah, we
I'll,
can pause the questions and go back to Tony.
Yeah, we'll go back to your questions. We're going to try to answer everybody's question.
Tony, you
Tony, you
there?
have the floor.
Oh, Tony, it looks like you're muted.
You muted.
Okay,
There you
how's
go.
that? Good?
Yeah, much better.
Okay, thanks. So I switched rooms. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is a map that shows a flood control project that's currently under construction in Middletown. The amount you see there, $130 million, was 2021. That is now well over $200 million that's being spent on this project. And just one example of where these sorts of rules don't really make any sense for areas where there's flood control systems in place, because they don't take these into account at all. So if you live in this area where you're now going to be protected by levees and pumps and floodgates and those sorts of things, all the money that's been spent on this work is irrelevant. You still have to elevate your house, and nothing changes for you. So you know, there's a lot of areas in this with these regulations that don't coordinate with other rules and regulations that are already out there. We'll get to those in a little bit more as we proceed. So you can switch the slide. So just a couple of photos to show you what the flood control system looks like. This is a section of the levee wall that's been completed. You can keep going, Frank. This is a floodgate system. These are automatically closed during major storm events. There will be 2 more of these built that close down roads so that there's no access through, and it protects and holds back flood water, essentially, and protects the people who live on the other side of it. Keep going. This is the pump system. It shuts that those gates drop down, close down the water coming into the creeks, and there's a pump system that pumps out rainwater as it accumulates in the back waters, pumps them out into the bay, so it keeps the areas behind the flood control system dry. Okay, next one. So just want to show you an example of some of the things that have changed in these communities as a result of Hurricane Sandy. This is 2 houses that were significantly damaged. They were small bungalows. If you go to the next slide, you can see what they look like now. Their value has significantly increased as a result. The property values have significantly increased as a result. One of the things that we're going to find with these new regulations, if they were to become effective, is that they'll have a really significant impact on the values of properties that haven't been rebuilt yet. The added cost of construction to add the 5 feet will be significant, and I'll show you some more examples of that. You can keep sliding through, Frank.
Yeah.
That's those same houses. Again, those values, that's not 2021. Those are well over $500,000 now, and they were under $100,000 before Sandy. Keep going. This house, there was a small house on this property. It was replaced with a house that sold in 2021. Now it's assessed for $860,000. So you can see the significant impact that's happened on home values in the area. And the problem this creates, that we'll get to a little bit more detail later, is that not all the houses have been rebuilt yet. Some of them didn't need to be. And so what you have is these new houses significantly impacting assessed values in a neighborhood. And so what happens is people's taxes are going up because of these new home values, and they've done nothing to their homes yet. And so it's starting to create a bit of a gentrification issue, which again, we'll talk a little bit more about as we proceed. Go to the next one. You can just scroll through these. Just shows a few examples of houses that were, rebuilt in sort of odd ways. It shows this property is worth about $900,000 now. And it had a little 1-story bungalow on it. And this shows you the out of proportion character that it creates. As you can see, you've got two houses that have been elevated, but one house that has not been. One of the things people note from the storms like Sandy is that they didn't knock out large swaths of neighborhoods. What they did was kind of a checkerboard damage. So you might have two houses on a street that were damaged, two houses that weren't. No one knows exactly why it works out that way, but that's the way it is. So two of those houses were substantially damaged and had to be elevated. The house in the middle did not have to be. Now, eventually it may one day, but these new rules will have an impact on that. Next slide. Another example, small bungalow, hasn't been rebuilt yet, right next to a house that's been elevated substantially. But you can imagine if that house there has to be 5 feet higher, the significant impact that's going to have on the relationship in neighborhoods of the scale of houses. Next slide. One of the things that's going to be a real practical impact, and if any of you have been to any of the shore communities that have been redeveloping since Sandy, you'll see these kind of what I call tortured stairways. They have to create these turnarounds. You go to the next one. There's a couple more examples of this, where they've had to create these really creative stairway systems just to get into the house. Many of these properties are small. They have small front setbacks, and if you have to build on the existing footprint, which in many cases will be required, you can see that it's almost impossible to get a stairway that can get you into the house. Go to the next slide.
Yeah.
Next slide, Frank. Frank? Oh, there you go. So again, here's another example of these stairways. I've spoken to the construction officials, and what they say is that if this now has to be 5 feet higher, it will add significant cost. Obviously, just the foundation alone is going to be 5 feet higher. All the additional costs for masonry work. The extension of utilities into the house will be 5 feet longer, more expensive. And these stairways, in some cases, may be impossible to do without potentially encroaching into the street right-of-way. There's not always going to be room to turn these stairways enough times to get you properly accessed into the house. The footings for these stairways are going to have to be larger, more substantial, again, adding cost. Next slide. Here you can see a stairway where they had to actually exit it into the driveway. That was the only way to make it work because they couldn't go forward any further. And just imagine if you're a EMT and you're trying to get somebody out of one of these houses on a stretcher. Significantly complicated, very challenging. Our services have had to go to mechanized equipment to get people downstairs because they become so difficult to work with if you're literally holding a stretcher with a couple of 100 pounds on it. All right, next one. That's really the end of the photos. I guess the key point of this, one of the things that has not been done with these regulations is it doesn't seem like there's been any coordination with DEP, not DEP, FEMA, NFIP, and some of you from shore communities may participate in the community rating system. So, for example, one of the concerns is, will the community rating system now recognize this additional 5 feet in elevation? If so, will that negatively impact communities that currently participate in the community rating system? And will you potentially lose points if you have a number of houses that are under this new 5 foot additional height requirement? And so we don't know what impact this is going to have on flood insurance. Will your flood insurance, if you've elevated your house now to what's required in your community, and now all of a sudden there's a new regulation that says, well, it really should be 5 feet higher, are flood insurance programs and insurance companies going to say, well, you're going to have to pay a higher rate now because you don't meet this new 5-foot additional height requirement from the state. And so will flood insurance rates for people who are not this much higher go up? The other potential scenario, which again is not really addressed, is if somebody has legitimately raised their house under the current regulations, and they want to then do an improvement to their properties. And those of you who deal with floodplain issues a lot, you know that now that there's a rule that says if you do anything improvement to your home that adds 50% to the assessed value, you now have to elevate the house. Well, now you have a house that's already been elevated, but now the person wants to put another story on their house, or they want to do some addition to their house that adds value to it. Will they have to again raise their house, even though it's been raised in accordance with the regulations that were in place at the time? And if they don't, will it affect, again, flood insurance? So again, there's been no coordination with, from what I can tell anyway, no coordination with FEMA or National Flood Insurance Program on any of these things. And the biggest impact ultimately is going to have is that in these Bayshore communities in Monmouth County and in Middlesex County, and I'm sure many other places around the state, they're not occupied by wealthy people. They are some of our lowest income neighborhoods. And so the significant impact on land values, depressing them significantly, has a real impact on the most vulnerable of people. It makes their lower valued properties even lower when you're raising the cost of rebuilding a house on the property. I know that what the state seems to be trying to do is push people towards retreat from the shore.
Right.
And I get the concept, right? That you shouldn't have all these houses close to the shore in vulnerable areas. The fact is they're already there. As they even said, 94% or whatever is already developed. The problem you have is buyouts don't work in all communities. We've experienced this here where if I went to a homeowner in some of these communities who have a small bungalow home, what the state would pay them to buy them out essentially would not leave them with enough money to buy another house in the same community. They'd end up having to move and maybe move quite a distance. So you're then forcing people into a situation where they may have to take their kids out of their school system, transfer to different school district. That sort of trauma is not what we should be doing to people, again, who are already vulnerable due to limited incomes. So lots of aspects of this have not been really coordinated with communities, not been really coordinated to understand the real impacts. I get if you read through the regulations, they frequently refer to the fact that, flooding and flood hazards disproportionately affect communities of color, communities with concentrations of lower income households, and that there's certainly truth to that. However, these regulations even have a greater impact on those communities. And so I don't think it's been thought out well enough when you establish rules like this that don't really look at the real life impacts, the day-to-day impacts. The 3% lot coverage limitation, for example, if you own in one of these neighborhoods a vacant 5,000 square foot lot, which is very, very common, the 3% would limit you to 150 feet of lot coverage. Well, obviously you can't build a house in that way. So essentially they'll eliminated all value in that property. Will then you see communities and property owners start to say, well, state, you've taken away all the value of my property. I can't build anything on it now. You have to buy it from me. And if they do, well, have we factored that into the equation that we may be doing buyouts where we devalue properties so much by making them unbuildable, unusable, that we end up having to face the issue of buyouts. And then finally, I think one of the impacts that's not been adequately addressed is there's lots of communities, and Middletown is one, and there's many of them up and down the Bayshore that are mostly or almost entirely in flood hazard areas or the new IRE zones.
Right.
Well, if you have parks, recreation facilities in those areas, these new regulations may make it very, very difficult, if not impossible, to improve those parks. You want to put in new basketball courts, you want to put in new tennis courts, you want to modify fields or build new fields in existing recreation facilities. You may find it impossible to improve recreation facilities within these areas just because they're in a flood hazard area. So again, a lot of issues that I think have not been adequately vetted with local governments or the business community. So that's about it at this point. There's going to be a lot more questions on this as we go forward. And I think you need to look at how these will impact your particular communities, because they're going to be different from place to place. You may have other public facilities in these areas that will require improvements one day that may become impossible. You may have firehouses, first aid buildings in these now impacted areas that may be difficult to ever improve or renovate. So that's it for now. Happy to take questions. I'll turn it back over to John or Frank.
Well, we have, yeah, just to echo what Tony said, he's right. I mean, there hasn't been sufficient coordination with municipalities and communities relating to the impacts. And, that's one of the points that the Cape May County and the 16 Cape May municipalities have made in the resolution they've adopted. Needs to be public engagement, community engagement sessions, interface with the municipalities relating to impacts, and sort of a corollary to that. What about funding and support of the local municipalities relating to any required cost attributable here? What about looking at that aspect of it also? And these points have been raised again by Cape May County communities, New Jersey Business and Industry Association. I think the league will be pursuing some of that, also with DEP in the state. And I can't emphasize strongly enough that in each municipality, for each municipality maybe here on this session, and or the engineering firms that represent municipalities and private builders, that you do an analysis in the particular municipality concerned of how these specific rules will impact building and development, availability of housing, affordable housing in those areas immediately, because you don't want to be in a situation where you haven't analyzed for impacts and these rules become final, and you then have to comply with them. Better to look at analyze it right now, and to the extent you have issues, make your voices heard. I mean, that would be my strong recommendation. A couple of there are a lot of questions. I mean, I don't know if we're going to be able to get
John, before we do that, I think Frank has a couple of wrap-up comments.
Okay.
And Sierra is monitoring the questions, so she can direct the questions to us. So why don't we let Frank wrap up while Sierra prepares questions for the group?
Yeah, so I'm not really sharing anything that hasn't already been said, but just wanted to reiterate some of the key dates here. So again, as we've mentioned before, the comment deadline, it closes November 3rd. The league, we anticipate submitting probably some substantial comments, but one of the things, I guess it's an ask here of folks is, as you review this individually for your own municipalities, if you see anything or any concerns, raise up, because again, this is a huge shift here, this proposal. So anything that you have that you've covered, if you share that with us, that's going to go a long way in what we submit to the DEP and trying to get any kind of changes, any amendments through the comment process. Again, I just want to reiterate, that nothing has changed yet. This is still just a proposal, although it's, whether or not how much they change, that's up for discussion, but nothing has changed yet. But it would, as they've mentioned numerous times, the summer of 2025 is when they anticipate adoption of pretty much whatever they put out. We've got to be out in front of this to one, submit comments, and then if adopted, if there's any potential challenges down the road. So right now it's all about information gathering, at least from the league's perspective, to see what changes we need to address, what we need to ask for in our comments. So we will have my contact information is available at the last slide here, where you can just give us a call. But happy to have this discussion with anyone independently as well. And with that, I guess we can start going through some of the questions here.
Sierra, can you pick
Yes.
up where we left off?
Can you
I
hear
think
me
we left
loud and
off on Mr. Stinson, Ed Stinson.
Yeah, that's where we're going to. Can everybody hear me loud and clear?
Yes.
Okay, great. Just so everybody knows, I have put a thumbs up on all your questions that I could catch. I will unthumb them when we answer your questions, so we can keep track of everything. The first one from Ed Stinson, we have, did you say the rules require a minimum of 20-foot setback to bulkheads?
Yes. A 25-foot setback from top of bank or bulkhead is mandatory with some exceptions. So the answer to that is yes.
Okay. And from Janice, we have, how might these new rules affect those properties that have LOMAs based on certified elevations?
Well,
I can't answer that.
But,
I cannot answer
I can
that.
address
Maybe
that
you
a little
can,
bit.
Tony.
You're talking about LOMAs, local map amendments. Again, it doesn't address that at all. I would hope that if you had a local map amendment on a particular property, that would still be valid. But again, it's another area where they need to be clearer about the impacts of these regulations. Because what typically happens is that they aren't clear, and a year after they're implemented, there's lawsuits because people interpret things differently, and it's just creates a nightmare trying to interpret them when there's no clear guidance on some of these questions.
We have from Cape May County, with Bill A4 and his companion bill S50 abolishing COLA, appropriating 16 million to cause of establishing affordable housing and revising framework for affordable housing obligations for municipalities. How will the rules impact municipal affordable housing obligations with 3% restrictions on lot coverage within special flood hazard areas?
That's a very good, excellent question. And the answer is that I don't believe it's been thought about or analyzed, right? Because you have a competing requirements for affordable housing. And one of the major concerns, at least that certainly at the Cape May County municipalities have articulated, is the impact on tourism, on workers in the tourism industry, housing for them, and then the affordable housing requirements generally. I don't think there's been any analysis made or any opportunity to adjust the requirements here, the real rule requirements to take into account affordable housing obligations that I'm aware of. I think this is just dropped from the environmental department side without thinking about COA implications, and that's one of the big issues that's been raised.
Yeah, I really don't think that there's been this like holistic analysis of, how is this going to impact other aspects. Part of the rulemaking process is they have to go through and do this analysis on housing affordability. But as you've seen, it's pretty typical in any rulemaking from any agency that analysis is always lacking. So it's going to be interesting to see, especially here as the numbers. DCA is going to put out these numbers in the next coming weeks here. And municipalities are then going to have to adopt their plans and adjust their zoning. You're going to be doing that without any finalized rules on, hey,
Exactly.
what areas, what land is really undevelopable now? Where are we restricted from impervious surface? What's going to happen? So the two really are in opposition to each other and don't really mesh well.
Okay, thanks, John. Thanks, Frank. We have another question from Eileen. Have not had a chance to review what impacts does this have on communities not on the coast or near the ocean? Is it all the same? Are
I
there
can-
particular aspects that non-coastal communities should pay attention to?
Okay, I can try to answer this. Yes, I mean, in terms of non-coastal communities, there are impacts in interior wetlands and regulated waters in internal in the state. So there is an impact in development as it relates upon wetlands areas or, wetlands transition areas, etc. So yes, to that extent, there is an impact. I don't think it's been particularly analyzed to this point, but it does have an impact. And in terms of impact on the community, okay, not near the coast. Yeah, I think you need to look at the wetlands sections of the proposed rule and do a deep dive analysis there as it impacts your particular municipality.
Okay, so Chair MP asks, the change from permit by rule to permit by registration includes some construction activities, including fencing, approved forest management plans, as well as trail creation and invasive plant control. It will not only require projects, but be registered, but implementation must begin within 180 days of registration. It will also allow for DEP to inspect the activities. Any thoughts about the impacts from this change?
I mean, I think the impacts there are going to be, are pretty obvious. Anytime you're doing something that previously was simply a permit by rule, you now have to use this online registration system that their
Right.
online portal that the DEP is creating and submitting your compliance information. I don't know exactly what that looks like. Is that an engineering report? Is it just an affidavit? What exactly does it entail? So you really can't give with any specificity what the impacts are, but certainly there's going to be an added expense and added requirement here.
Yeah, one thing I'd add to that is there's no doubt if the rules become effective and that these are the requirements that are in place. Again, many of the people who own property in these areas are lower income communities, and you're adding significant expense for them to maybe do modest improvements to their property. And so the whole idea of trying to make housing more affordable for people, or trying to preserve naturally occurring affordable housing, which is what many of these communities are, you're making it almost impossible. And you're harming the very people you're trying to help.
States, questions, is regulation inundation defined in the IRZ, daily high tides, 2-year storms, etc.? Is there any discussion on net fill similar to fluvial areas?
I don't believe there's any discussion that I recall on net fill similar to fluvial, but there is a definition of the IRZ in the regulations that you could look at. I mean, I would say look at the specific, dive into the rules, look up IRZ zones, inundation risk zone section, and go into the definitional sections there, and that gets your answer.
Ed Stinson, questions again. Can you discuss the 3% impervious requirement proposed in the new rule? Is the limit additional coverage above what exists, or is it a max total of 3%?
The way I read that is that it's not an addition. There's some language that says, well, if you have an existing structure, you can elevate it and it has to stay with, or you can rebuild in the existing footprint, the prior footprint. But if you're doing something new, or if a lot is undeveloped, you're limited to 3%.
Yes, that's my understanding too.
Okay, this is not exactly a question, but it's a comment, so I'm just gonna note it. In a prior DEP session, they stated that the raised elevation will not impact NFIP flood assurance. A participant did note that mortgage holders could insist that a site not being a flood zone could be forced by the bank to purchase flood insurance.
Okay, I can start. I don't see how DEP can say that the raised elevation will not impact flood insurance. I mean, they're two separate, right? You have flood insurance, but there hasn't been a real consideration of the impact of this rule on the flood insurance side. So I think it's a bit aggressive for the DEP, whoever said it, that the raised elevation will not impact the flood insurance, I just don't see how they could have said that.
Yeah, I totally agree. They're in no position to say that, as far as I'm concerned, unless they can show us that they've received correspondence from the National Flood Insurance Program that says, yes, if you do this, it won't alter flood insurance requirements. But I wouldn't believe that, even if they said it. The issue really has to do with banks, lenders. The lender could still require flood insurance based upon this higher elevation, or could set their rates based upon these higher elevations. So I think that's something that we still need to find out.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this is an example of a downstream consequence that hasn't been thought through.
Okay, I'm just curious myself, couldn't a survey negate that? People are getting a survey of the property.
Well, when you have a property in a flood hazard area, you need to do a survey, but you need to get what's called an elevation certificate. That's what establishes the base flood elevation for the property and how high the house has to be, the first floor of the house has to be raised to. So yeah, that's a standard part of the process, to have a survey and get an elevation certificate to determine base flood elevation, but now you're adding 6 feet to it.
All right, the other question we have is the 5 foot of additional flood elevation plus 1 foot of freeboard on top of the 3 foot additional flood elevation currently in place.
No, is what this is proposing.
Okay. And Karen Hughes asks, does a 3% impervious restriction apply to interior wetlands?
It's a good question. I think it applies to all development. That's my understanding, and that's what the NJBIA has interpreted as. I mean, basically, they've read this as the 3% impervious cover standard applies to all development. I think it may just relate to the inundation risk zone, not the wetlands impacts.
Yeah, I believe it applies to the inundation risk zone plus existing flood hazard areas.
Right.
Because the IRZ zone essentially expands your flood hazard area by X number of feet, depending on, you have to look at the map to see exactly how that's why it's really important that everyone look at the maps as they apply to your community, because in some cases they may have a lesser impact, and in some cases they could have a very significant impact.
Okay. Is there consideration for wetlands migration paths due CC in the regulations?
I don't know. I just don't know. I haven't read every single if you find anyone that can tell you they've read every one of the 1,000 pages, I'm not sure I believe them, but I don't recall reading that.
That does wrap up all of our questions. So I will mute and allow you guys to wrap up.
Okay. All I can say is this deserves immediate and focused attention for everyone who is working for a municipality, representing municipalities as an outside consultant engineer, working for private developers in these impacted areas. You need to dive in here and analyze the impact of this rule as to your particular projects, municipalities, and do it right now. It's worth the time and the effort, with engineers, town attorneys, any others are involved in this kind of analysis and work. Very important to do it now. And certainly the league can be a facilitator to passing through information, taking positions on behalf of the municipalities as a whole who are impacted, and being a resource for everyone. So there's a lot here. I mean, I've been doing this kind of work for a long time, and I've never seen a rule like this over 1,000 pages. It's just been dropped. The problem is, the objective may be laudatory, right? You'd be concerned about resiliency, flood impacts, sea level rise, global warming, climate change. That's fine, but you can't just drop a massive rule like this out of the sky without considering the impact on affected parties. This needs to be This needs to be further evaluated, and particularly in light of competing considerations which have been mentioned today, such as affordable housing, for example. Needs to be done. Otherwise, we're making a problem that perhaps we're making the whole situation here worse, and we're going to wind up with consequences that will be more significant than what the problem we're trying to solve. My 2 cents.
All right, thank you, John, Tony, Frank, Sierra, and for everyone for joining us. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the program, this is being recorded and will be posted on the league website hopefully by tomorrow. The slide deck will be made available as a PDF, and will be sent to all of you. I want to thank the speakers for their presentation. Not easy to talk about a 1,000+ rule proposal in just over an hour, but they did the best we could. This is still obviously evolving, so please keep us informed of what you're finding about it. Stay tuned to what the league is putting out on it, and friendly reminder, we're just a month and a half away from the league conference, where I'm sure this will be a topic of discussion as well. So with that, thank you all for joining us, and have a great day.